Frozen winds carved paths through the endless white wilderness. Elias Granger, 32 years old, had battled frozen pipes throughout the merciless day. Ice crystals had shattered the water lines once more during the night. As twilight painted the sky purple, he trudged back to his remote wooden homestead. Smoke ribbons still curled from the stone chimney, carrying his kerosene lantern through the doorway. He brushed crystallized snow from his heavy jacket and stopped cold. Prince, no bigger than a child's, traced a nervous path to his fireplace and back toward the entrance. His muscles tensed as he reached for his hunting rifle, but paused when he detected quiet stirring from his modest cooking area. Moving cautiously forward, he lowered the lamp and spoke gently. "Someone there?" A shaky, delicate voice drifted from the stove's amber glow. "Forgive me. I believe this dwelling was empty. There's nowhere left for me to turn." Elias's grip loosened on the weapon. Wiping frost from his beard, he discovered a young lady surrounded by toppled furniture and broken crockery. Her skirt's edge was crusted with ice and mud. Her exhale formed clouds in the lamplight, while damp hair framed her face in tangled locks. Frost clung to her colorless skin. Her gaze darted between his rifle and the exit behind her. Annabelle Moore, 24, a contracted bride who had journeyed 30 miles to a settlement where nobody appeared to claim her, had wandered along mountain ridges through a howling snowstorm until she glimpsed the distant amber light of Elias's dwelling. She knocked briefly, then entered through the unlocked entrance, perhaps hoping inhabitants remained, or that spirits might show more mercy than the living. Elias remained motionless for several moments. Wind battered the wooden shutters as something stirred within his chest. He gradually lowered his weapon. Annabelle's frame sagged with relief. He retrieved a thick woolen wrap from his cabinet, placed it around her shivering form, then crouched to kindle the stove flame.
Ow.
Life with a sharp hiss, setting a kettle among the glowing coals. He began feeding logs to the hearth blaze. She clutched the blanket tightly, offering a weak nod. Until morning, he murmured quietly, "Stay while the tempest rages." She gazed upward, eyes enormous, mouth quivering. Another silent nod. Nothing more. Moving deliberately, he positioned a small Castrian pot of hot tea upon the wooden surface, indicating a nearby seat. She settled without palms pressed against the warm metal. Gentle steam clouded the atmosphere. Elias hung his coat over a chair for her use, then retreated to arrange another stool, scanning his provisions' basic containers of ground corn, dried legumes, cured meat, nothing particularly welcoming. He poured tea into a chipped ceramic mug, sliding it her direction. She sipped carefully, fingers trembling against the vessel. Studying him through weary lashes, he observed her with silent focus. Her irises resembled winter mist, hollow and tired, as though she'd encountered too few gentle souls. He experienced an unfamiliar yearning, like rope binding him to something he hadn't dared pursue since his beloved perished 2 seasons prior. She drank again, glancing doorward as if anticipating someone more deserving might enter. Elias cleared his throat softly. "Dinner soon. If you desire warm food, assistance would help. Are you able?" She nodded wordlessly. He hesitated briefly. Help or rest, both acceptable. Standing with careful purpose, she retrieved a tin vessel and began chopping herbs from a container beside the table. He watched her movements steady, exact, weary, understanding that giving her tasks would comfort her more than silence alone. The blizzard raged. Beyond, while darkness deepened, Elias lit another lamp, observing her stir cornmeal and salted pork in the iron pan. He placed the spoon within reach, sharing his portion. She offered only grateful acknowledgement, though her expression softened. Wind shook the cabin timber, and outside he heard snow cascading from the rooftop in muted crashes. He angled the kettle toward flame for simmering and went to gather bedding. Returning, he found her wrapped in his wool jacket, settling toward sleep on a low wooden bench. He sat opposite the fireplace, deliberately ignoring the unexpected tightness in his chest, watching flames dance. She murmured gratitude. "You didn't turn me away," her words barely audible. He responded with only a slight head movement. but in that gesture accepted something both delicate and valuable. The mantle clock had ceased months ago, yet time lived again in that flickering radiance. Elias glanced once more at Annabelle's slumbering figure alone, exhausted, forsaken by a world she trusted, and felt warmth rising that no winter could extinguish. He draped a blanket over her and settled deeper into his seat, as if guarding something rare. Outside, wind shrieked, but within the dwelling fire crackled, and two existences began an unexpected transformation. Snow descended through morning like powdered grain. Elias's cabin timbers groaned softly as wind swept the roof. Inside, flames still burned, casting gentle orange patterns across floorboards. Annabelle lay curled on the hearthside bench, features slack with exhaustion, one arm wrapped protectively. Around herself, Elias occupied his chair, wakeful. His sleep had eluded him, his attention fixed on her, watchful yet distant. He wasn't accustomed to companions, certainly not women who emerged from storms carrying only bruised hands and fearful eyes. But she hadn't attempted deception, she hadn't pleaded. She'd simply asked, then fallen quiet. At sunrise, Elias slipped outdoors, tended his horse, broke ice from the water basin, and chopped sufficient wood for the day. Returning indoors, the kettle was already warming, 2 cups arranged on the table. Annabelle stood at the wash basin, quietly cleaning last evening's tin plates. Her sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair secured with a ribbon scrap she must have retrieved from her belongings. "I hope you don't object," she said softly, noticing him. "I thought earning my place seemed appropriate." Elias shrugged, not unkindly. "If you damaged something, mending it would be your concern." She smiled faintly and continued washing. Then, without turning, she asked, "Do you have sewing supplies?" He gestured toward a wooden container near the fireplace. She found it, threaded a needle, and sat by the window, repairing one of his worn flannel garments, her fingers precise. Elias poured coffee into 2 vessels, placing one beside her. He sat across the room, cradling his own cup in silence before, inquiring, "Who summoned you?" Annabelle's hand froze mid-stitch. Her throat moved once before she responded, "Unknown." "The correspondence reached my boarding house through the Denver bureau, mentioned a gentleman in Bitter Hollow requiring a wife. I signed the contract, boarded the stage, and upon arrival, nobody came. The station attendant directed me toward the path and suggested hurrying to catch someone traveling north. She looked up, eyes apologetic. I suppose I wasn't his desired choice after all." Elias frowned, staring into his cup. "You mentioned nursing experience." Annabelle nodded. "During the Virginia conflict? Afterward, little remained. My father succumbed to fever, to winters past. My mother lost hope before spring. The marriage agency was my final option." Elias remained silent for some time. Snow brushed windows like whispered uncertainties. Outside, the town road was disappearing beneath drifts. He rose, pulled his coat from the wall hook, and approached the door. Opening it, wind howled inward. Annabelle flinched. "You're departing?" Glanced over his shoulder. "Plan to escort you to town's church. Let Reverend Whitaker resolve this situation, but..." He gestured toward snow, swallowing the fence posts. "We're traveling nowhere today." Annabelle lowered her gaze. Understood. That evening, the storm intensified. Wind screamed through log gaps. As Elias fed wood to the fire until it glowed hot and constant, he opened a small container from the rear cupboard containing wrapped parcels of dried mushrooms, morels collected from northern ridges. Untouched for 3 years, he began chopping them into the pot over flames. Annabelle looked up, surprised. "Those are precious." He nodded once. "Save them for the coldest day." Her brow creased.
Ice.
"Is today coldest?" Elias stirred the soup slowly.
Ice.
"Perhaps not, but it's the first day someone else has occupied this table." Since she died, Annabelle went still. He ladled soup into 2 bowls, handing one to her. She accepted it with both hands, watching him carefully. "I'll ensure you reach town," Elias said, "when the storm clears." Annabelle nodded. She tasted the soup and closed her eyes as warmth spread through her. Outside, wind pounded the roof, but inside the cabin something unfamiliar settled between them, quiet. understanding and trust's fragile beginning. The storm persisted 3 days. Snow accumulated like desert dunes along the porch, and the sky remained ash-colored. Inside the cabin, air mixed pine smoke, steam, and the peaceful rhythm of two people learning to share space without excessive conversation. Elias maintained his habit-splitting wood, boiling water, preserving meat, feeding the mule when visibility permitted. But now a second cup graced the table, another pair of boots dried by the hearth, a woman's gentle humming when she believed he wasn't listening. On the second evening, Elias noticed raw skin along his left hand. Cold had penetrated deeper. Then realized the surface layer blistered red and pale. Annabelle knelt beside him without request, pulling salve from her traveling bag. "You should have mentioned this," she murmured, smoothing ointment over skin with gentle fingers. "I've endured worse," he muttered. "I know. So have I." She bound his hand in cloth and tied it carefully, then returned to her corner without another word. Later that night, Elias moved her chair closer to the hearth, while she wasn't watching. He poured the last pine needle tea into her cup, leaving his empty. Annabelle noticed, but said nothing. She simply wrapped her cold hands around the vessel and nodded once in appreciation. That night, they both lingered near the fire longer than usual, neither willing to admit the silence between them had grown warmer. On the third day, after lunch of vegetable soup and hard biscuits, Annabelle looked toward the door and said softly, "I used to measure days by correspondence." Elias turned toward her. "My betrothed and I, he wrote daily until Gettysburg." She reached into her bag and withdrew a folded paper snowflake, yellowed at edges. She unfolded it carefully, laying it on the table like something sacred. This was his final sending. It accompanied a note. "I will create 100 more when I return." He never did. Elias stared at the delicate cutouts, the crooked stars and arrows sliced into paper. "I was at Gettysburg," he said after a moment, his voice rough. "Second day left flank. Lost 3 ribs and partial hearing." Annabelle looked at him slowly. "You were there?" He nodded. "Many men left something behind at that place." It looked back at the snowflake. "So did I." Fire crackled between them. Elias stood, walked to the mantel. He opened a drawer beneath the shelf and retrieved a weathered photograph, edges curled, glass cracked. It showed a woman with auburn hair and a gentle, crooked smile. "My wife," he said, placing it beside the snowflake, "died of scarlet fever. I buried her under that ridge behind the barn." Annabelle's eyes softened. She reached out and adjusted the snowflake slightly so it sat beside the photograph, not covering it, not replacing it, only accompanying it. Elias looked at her, then at the table, and nodded. They didn't speak of it again that night. But when wind howled and fire sputtered low, Elias rose and added 2 more logs, not for warmth, but because something in the silence needed protection. Outside snow continued falling, but inside grief began thawing just a little. By the 5th morning, sky broke wide open. Wind calmed, sun cracked pale and thin above the white horizon, and the world appeared scrubbed clean. Elias harnessed the mule, wrapped Annabelle in spare wool coat, and set off down the icy road toward Galloway town, 20 miles over hard snow and frozen ruts. They didn't converse much, but Annabelle's gloved hand gripped the sled's side rail. Her eyes remained locked on hills ahead. Elias kept his gaze forward too, jaw set tight. The town appeared just past midday. Chimneys smoked, boots crunched, and gossip traveled faster than snow melt. They reached the church first, a squat white building with bell tower and frost-crusted windows. Elias tied the mule and led Annabelle up the steps. Inside, warmth hit first, then silence. A few women sat knitting near back pews. One looked up, eyes narrowing. The pastor, a stout man in his 60s with crooked collar, came down the aisle. When Elias called his name, "We need placement for her," Elias said. "Mail order bride abandoned up north." "She's no trouble." The pastor squinted. "Name?" "Annabelle Moore," she said softly. He pulled out a heavy book, flipped pages. "No record," he muttered. "No husband registered for her. No payment documented. She's not legally wed." "I never claimed to be," Annabelle said quietly. Someone behind them whispered just loud enough, "She's one of the rejected ones. You can always tell." Another voice answered, sharper, "Came all this way just to get passed around." Annabelle's breath caught. She turned, backing toward the door. Elias stood still, his jaw working silently, but he said nothing. Not yet. Annabelle pushed open the church doors and stepped into cold. Snow had begun falling again, slow and hushed. She stood under the awning, arms wrapped around herself, trembling as much from shame as cold. Elias followed. She didn't look at him, just whispered, "I'm not who you believe I am." "I know exactly who you are," Elias said. "You emerged from the snow into my kitchen. You mended my sleeve. You prepared my tea. You cleaned ash from my stove. And you never requested anything but space to breathe." She blinked, eyes glistening. "I brought you here," he said, voice low and steady, to be claimed. "I didn't know it would be by me." She looked up at him really, looked, wind curled around them, sharp and sweet with pine. "I'm not pure," she whispered. "I'm not whole," he replied. "Not unchanged." Snow caught in her lashes. She started to speak, but Elias stepped forward, removed his glove, and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. Not forcefully, just enough for her to feel the truth in it. "Do you want to return with me?" he asked. Annabelle swallowed hard. "I don't have anywhere else to turn." "You do now," Elias said. They turned together, walking down steps toward the mule and sled. Behind them, the church bell tolled, not for a wedding, not for a funeral, but maybe, just maybe, for the beginning of something not yet named. Snow still blanketed the world when Elias and Annabelle returned to the Granger homestead. But inside the cabin, morning felt warmer than any storm could be. Elias stoked ashes in the old iron stove until embers glowed orange. He adjusted the chimney so smoke cleared easily, then began arranging split logs in the rack. Annabelle watched from the doorway, wrapped in her wool coat, breath misting in. Soft light. She didn't speak, just nodded when he indicated a wooden chair. Elias carried in furnishings a wooden table he'd carved years ago, and a spare bedroll from the loft. He cleared a corner near the stove and placed a small trunk beside it. Annabelle helped by sweeping floors with a hand broom and stacking blankets neatly. Her quiet presence filled the room more than any words could. He went outside to fetch water and ice from the trough. She pulled a rag bag from her travel satchel and began mending a torn sleeve. She didn't ask, but Elias noticed. Later, he found a tin of dried cornmeal and gave it to her. She smiled, measuring out enough with a wooden spoon. When the stove was hot again, Elias gathered yellow cornmeal, a handful of sugar, a bit of lard, and a pinch of salt. Annabelle joined him near the hearth, pulling out the skillet and wooden spoon, hands steady. She stirred batter slowly, humming softly under her breath. Elias watched her carefully, then set a skillet of fat and hot griddle near flames. She ladled batter onto it. The first cake hissed and browned. She flipped it gently and offered the steaming cornbread to him, torn in half without hesitation. He bit into it slowly. The crust was crisp, the middle soft and warm. He nodded, pleased. "I learned to bake when I was small," she said quietly. "My mother made cornbread every Sunday. I loved making sweets, and naturally, I made pies." He smiled faintly. "I haven't tasted any since my wife." Annabelle shook her head softly. "Simple, but it's something." They didn't talk much after. That only routine sounds, fires crackle, brooms whisking, soft scraping of wood, as Elias split logs outside. She showed him how to dampen cloth before sweeping to catch dust. He showed her how to cleave dry logs so they split along grain. Their hands brushed lightly as they worked just enough to acknowledge trust. Mid-afternoon. A small knock sounded at the door. Elias opened it to reveal Clarisse, the orphan girl from town, no more than 7, eyes damp from tears, shoulders shaking. Against a tattered shawl, she stood clutching a tin bucket that once held salt. "Mr. Granger," she said shyly, voice small, "I have nowhere to go. Might I have some wood, please?" Annabelle reached out instantly, stepping forward with a skillet of cornbread in hand. She knelt and offered the child a piece crumbly and warm. Clara took it, cheeks pink with surprise. Annabelle stood and motioned. Clara ducked inside, setting her bucket on the floor. Elias, stepping aside, fetched a small bundle of kindling and a few split logs from the rack. Clara's eyes widened, simply said, "Take this tonight, and if you're hungry, more cornbread will be ready in the morning." He filled the basket to the brim. Clara bowed in a manner too polite for her age. She put the wood into her bucket and scurried out, cornbread in hand. Annabelle closed the door and leaned against it, breath catching. "I should have warned you not to open the door," she murmured. Elias reached out, brushed a crumb from her sleeve, and placed the empty cornbread skillet on the table. "I don't want you to face hunger alone," he said softly. The sky outside softened. Into evening, snow flurries drifted. But inside the cabin, something settled that hadn't been there before, sense of home becoming possible. That night, after tucking Annabelle into the bedroll near the stove, Elias came to her corner with a small wooden board. By its dark grain, he burned words with a heated poker. This cabin is no longer a place of silence. He leaned over the hearth and placed the board gently against the wall. Annabelle stirred, but didn't wake. Elias stood back and examined his work by candlelight. The letters glowed warm, bold, but simple. Beneath them, a tiny sprig of lavender, tied with string, lay pressed. "It's time for warmth again," he said softly, to no one but the room. Outside winds sighed through the eaves. Inside the hearth crackled, and in that moment a cabin once isolated by snow and sorrow became a place where quiet gestures spoke louder than words, and where a single decision shaped the turning of two lives forever. Morning came crisp and sharp. Sky stretched clean and blue. Snow outside crusted under rising sun's light. Annabelle stood on the porch, sleeves rolled up, pinning laundry along a line stretched between two cedar posts. Her cheeks were pink from cold, hands red from washing. Behind her, inside the cabin, Elias was sanding a length of pine near the fireplace, hands sticky with resin. He whistled low under his breath, a habit long forgotten and newly returned. Then came the sound of hooves crunching frosts, low and deliberate. Annabelle looked up. A large black wagon rolled into the clearing, the kind used to haul supplies, or cattle, or sometimes worse. It stopped with a jolt. The door creaked open. Out stepped a man in a long tan coat and hat to clean for a place like this. Roy Mercer, 45, tall, slick, with silver buckles on his boots and a ledger always tucked under his arm. Annabelle's breath caught. Arms lowered, face drained of color. "Roy," she whispered, almost inaudible. He grinned as he approached. "Hands in pockets? Well, I'll be damned. You made yourself cozy." Without knocking, Roy pushed through the cabin door, boots thudding across wooden floor. Annabelle followed slowly, frozen. Elias turned at the sound, wiping hands on a rag, eyes narrowed. Roy held up a folded piece of paper. "She's mine." The order. "Contract signed and paid. Deposits right here in ink. Which means what you've got here is property, cowboy." Annabelle stepped back, trembling. Elias stood still, letting words settle, and he walked forward slowly, placing himself between them. Roy smirked. "You hiding my goods, cowboy?" Elias said nothing. Roy pushed him. Elias staggered, caught his footing, and without a word swung. His fist met Roy's jaw with a dull crack. Roy stumbled backward, hitting the table's edge. A thin trickle of blood ran from his nose. Outside, a few neighbors drawn by the wagon, and voices stopped near the gate. They watched silently. Roy straightened up, waving the paper in the air. "You all see this?" he shouted. "This woman was bought fair and legal. I came to collect what's mine," the crowd murmured. Elias wiped his knuckles on his coat, looked around, then turned into the cabin. Annabelle stood still near the stove, eyes brimming with tears. A minute later, Elias emerged. In his hand was a leather pouch, weathered thick. The one he'd buried under the loose floorboard, filled with silver coins and paper bills saved over 3 years. He placed it in Roy's hand. "There, that's what you paid plus more? Now she owes you nothing, and I owe her everything." Roy glanced inside the pouch. It was more than fair, more than the value of any paper contract. He opened his mouth to protest, but Elias stepped closer, voice like ice. Leave. And next time you put a price on a woman's life, make sure you can afford the man who loves her. Roy blinked. The crowd didn't cheer, didn't clap, but no one moved. To stop Elias, no one stepped to Roy's side. Elias turned, took Annabelle's hand, held it up for all to see. You called her mail order. I call her a miracle. She's not what I bought, she's what I waited for. Roy backed toward his wagon, wiping his nose with a silk handkerchief. He climbed aboard and said nothing as he turned the reins. The wagon groaned away, swallowed by trees. Silence fell. Then from the crowd, an old woman stepped forward. Her back was bent, her scarf tattered. She handed Annabelle a piece of hard bread wrapped in linen. Her eyes met Ilias's. Looks like someone finally bought back his soul, too. And with that, she walked away, boots crunching softly on frost. Elias didn't let go of Annabelle's hand. Inside, fire burned steady, and though no vows had yet been spoken, something permanent had taken root. Not in law, not in paper, but in action and in love. Spring arrived gently in Montagnat with trumpets, but with softened soil, blooming grass, and wind that carried life's returning scent. On a hill overlooking the wide valley, a small group gathered in silence. No ribbons fluttered, no polished boots or wedding bands glinted in sun. There was only earth, sky, and the hush of those who had come not out of obligation, but witness. This was the hill where Elias Granger had buried his father years before. He had come here often to speak into wind, to remember strength, to ask questions no one else could hear. Today he came not alone. Annabelle stood beside him, barefoot and damp. Grass, wearing a simple white dress, sewn by the old widow who had once handed her bread. The sleeves were slightly uneven, hem-stitched in mismatched thread, but the way it clung to wind made her look like a painting once folded away. Now finally framed, her hair fell loose over shoulders. In her hands, she held a single sprig of clover. Elias wore his oldest shirt, clean but faded at seams. In the breast pocket, a sprig of dried lavender peeked out, his mother's favorite flower. His boots were scuffed, hands stained from wood and work, but his eyes were steady. The town's old preacher, who had once scoffed at mail-order brides and called them paper promises, now stood with his Bible open and voice softened by time. "Have read many vows in my life," he said, "but today I will say none, because this is not tradition. This is something older." Elias turned to Annabelle. From his pocket he pulled a long braided cord made of dried meadow grass. It was rough, uneven, but strong. He held it out, hands trembling slightly. "Not a vow for show," he said. "A promise in dust, in years, in the storm that brought you to me. I'm yours, Annabelle, in full." Annabelle's lips quivered. Her voice came soft but clear. "And I've always been mine until now, because now I'm yours too." He tied the grass cord gently around both their wrists. It held. Wind lifted just then, as if exhaling, and from a fence post nearby, a small brown sparrow landed. Clara, standing beside the widow, clapped her hands. "They got wings now," she shouted. Laughter broke the stillness, not loud, not mocking, but the kind that comes when a heart unclenches, when healing is no longer hope but fact. After the ceremony, guests quietly began their descent. Some left. Small tokens bundles of dried herbs, cloth dolls, a jar of preserves on a wooden bench near the hilltop. Elias turned to Annabelle. "There's something I want to show you." They walked hand in hand to the great oak tree where his father's cross still stood, weathered and worn but unmoved. Beneath it, Elias knelt and opened a box carved from pine, hinges rusted but intact. Inside was a single photograph of his mother, young and smiling, holding a tin cup and a newborn lamb. Elias placed it gently beside another photo, one recently taken, one he'd asked a traveling photographer to capture without Annabelle knowing. Her sitting on the porch with Clara in her lap, both of them laughing. He stood and looked at the two images side by side. "Now they're both here," he said. "Two women who gave me life." Annabelle stepped behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and rested her cheek against his back. "And two souls who found each other," she whispered. "Not through letters, but through loss." Elias turned and kissed her brow. That night, there was no feast, no dancing, but there was warmth. The cabin glowed with soft candlelight. Clara played. On the floor with a straw doll, Annabelle baked cornbread that filled the home with a scent so rich, even silence felt full. Elias sat in his chair, the same one he'd carved alone, long ago. Now it creaked with the weight of two hands resting on his shoulders. And though he said nothing, his heart spoke loudly. The ranch no longer echoed with quiet, it sang with the sound of wooden wheels, morning laughter, and the clink of tin cups. Chickens clucked, water boiled, wind tapped gently at shutters. But more than any sound, more than any sign, the eyes of a man once broken by grief now held something brighter than pain, deeper than hope. Love not just found, but stayed. If this tale touched your spirit, the quiet bravery of Elias, the strength of Annabelle, and the way love flourished not from perfection, but from pain, then more stories await you on the frontier. At Wild West Echoes, we share tales of love that conquers distance, dust, and despair, of women who endure, of men who remember, hearts that find their way home even across silence and snow. So if you believe in second chances, in promises, made not with gold but with grit, in the kind of love that keeps a light burning in darkness, subscribe now to Wild West Echoes. Because somewhere out there in the wind, another heart is waiting to be discovered.